Welcome to The Lead, the New Lines magazine podcast. I'm Finbar Anderson, and this is the podcast where we delve into the biggest ideas, events, and personalities from around the world. More or less 100 years ago, a movement developed which at its height spanned the Atlantic, the major capitals of Western Europe, and much of the Middle East. As old social, scientific, and economic barriers were broken down, a huge number of people looked for new answers to the terrible conflicts and socio-economic issues of the day. Onto this stage stepped a new generation of thought leaders, who expertly combined many of the newest ideas of the modern age with old traditions of mysticism. These men, and they were nearly always men, shot to fame, building huge and utterly devoted followings across continents. Raphael Cormack is a writer whose work has appeared in the London Review of Books, the Times Literary Supplement, and New Lines magazine. In a new book, Holy Men of the Electromagnetic Age, A Forgotten History of the Occult, Cormack charts the rise and fall of two of the movement's standout figures, Tahrabe, a fakir born in Istanbul who would become a veritable celebrity in Paris and the United States, and Dr. Daesh, whose followers would proclaim him a prophet and who would draw the ire of some of the Middle East's most powerful men. They were born from the chaos of the 1920s as the world order collapsed. Europe stood in ruins, and the Ottoman Empire had been torn apart from the inside, and they held up a mirror to the desires and neuroses of that extraordinary century, Cormack writes. They came into a broken world as mysterious prophets, promising that a bright future lay beyond the horizon, which anyone could attain with the help of unexplainable occult sciences. Raphael Cormack, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks a lot for having me on. Yeah, I'm really excited to talk about the book.
Yeah, well, brilliant to have you on. You write in the book that as a fusion of so many ideas, this movement, it kind of defies easy definition, but you settled on the occult. So describe for us then the occult. What are the elements common to the various branches of this movement?
Yeah, I mean, that is a very good question, because if you try and come up with any kind of solid and simple definition of the occult, you end up defining pretty much all religions and various other things besides. The one I give roughly in the book is something like, the idea that there is power in things that we cannot see lying beyond the veil, beyond the realm of the perceptible, and also the idea that people in this world can harness that power for at least something. So this book came about, really, I suppose, after many, many years of kind of interest in the occult, sometimes slightly superficial interest in the occult, but for I think at least 10 or 15 years, I've always picked up little nuggets of the occult, particularly as it relates to the Middle East. And about 5 years ago, I decided I was going to turn this into a book. And so I started writing, and it ended up being massive because, as you can tell from that definition that I gave you, that could encompass a huge number of things. So actually, the book that we have in front of us now is the result of casting off lots of different chapters of people who went here and people who went there. There's a big history of Arabic spiritualism, which I sort of touch on, but can only touch on. But yeah, this book is basically the result of me looking at the 1920s, and the 1920s has become kind of my period. So my last book was on the nightclubs and the music halls of the 1920s. Yeah. And anywhere you look in that period, basically, it doesn't take too long until you happen across the occult. And these two men, so Tahrabe and Dr. Daesh, who we'll talk about in a little bit more detail, I actually came across both of them first as performers on the music hall stages. So both Tahrabe and Dr. Daesh came to Cairo in the late 1920s and put on shows. Daesh more sort of hypnotist show, and Tahrabe this Fakir show. We'll talk about exactly what the details of their shows are. And then from there, you delve in more and more and more, and you find this extremely complex series of links and of people who are inspired and followers and devotees, all infused by this idea of, what I'm calling the occult, which is the idea that even in the modern world, even in the what I call the electromagnetic age, right, the scientific age, there are still things that lie somewhere beyond the perceptible. But in this electromagnetic age, in this new age, there appears to be perhaps more opportunity to access that imperceptible world. So the 1920s is also the time when radio waves are really, radio is becoming an extremely popular thing in people's houses. You can get radio sets. And that, when you think about it, is a very strange concept, right? That there are voices in the ether kind of floating around everywhere. We're constantly surrounded by voices and music and whatever the rest of it is. And if you just get this little device that you can buy for $100 or whatever it is, you can tune into the dial and pick up those voices, which otherwise you wouldn't be able to see. And so this book was an attempt to explore what is going on with all of this. What are people getting out of this? Sort of, is there anything to it? And I don't mean necessarily like, was it true? I'm not sure that's a question we can answer, but why was it important? Why were so many people interested in it?
And as much as this book, it happens across continents in all of these major cultural hubs of the period, so Paris and Beirut and Cairo and New York. But while it's across those different places, it definitely feels like it's a product of a very particular time. And so you talk about how the 1920s is this period that fascinates you and there's all these scientific advances. But talk to me about the kind of geopolitical landscape and that kind of time period that we find ourselves in, because it feels like, I don't know if these men would have been able to do what they did in perhaps a different time. And so you write in the book, across the planet, the 1920s were a time of crisis and of rebirth, and a new world was forming on top of the wreckage of the past, and almost anything felt possible. So talk to me about that time.
Yeah, and I stand by that. That's definitely true. And the case with both of these guys, and why I eventually decided to pare back a lot of the other stuff and focus in particular on these two guys, is that they were products, in a sense, of that 1920s world. So spiritualism and the occult in Europe is often explained, I think with some justification, as a reaction to the First World War. The very simplistic version of that would be, everyone had lost sons or husbands or what have you in the First World War, and so they wanted to hear them again. So they went to these mysterious mediums who used the power of so-called spiritualism to communicate with the dead. And that is what spiritualism did. And they got these reassuring messages from beyond. That's the kind of standard reading of it. But these two guys give us a slightly different version of the story. They both come in the aftermath of the First World War, but they come as people who have survived the disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, basically. So maybe we'll focus on Tahir Bey first, because he seems to encapsulate this most clearly. So he claims to be an Egyptian fakir, but he is born in Istanbul, Krikor Kalfayan, an Armenian. And he doesn't experience the Armenian genocide. I mean, he is in Istanbul. One assumes some of his family members probably did directly. One reason for thinking that actually is because he was a cousin of Charles Aznavour, and we know that many of Charles Aznavour's family did experience the Armenian genocide. But what he did experience was this collapse of the Ottoman Empire. He leaves Istanbul in 1920 and becomes a refugee, basically. And I don't think you can understand him without realizing that he is a refugee. He is a man who has been cast out of a world that he once knew, that he was once part of, and is sent into Europe. He starts in Greece, then goes through Italy, and eventually becomes a big star in France.
Yeah, before we get to France, talk to me about what it is about Istanbul of the time. And it's difficult to, as you mentioned in the book, it's difficult to exactly place his path between Istanbul and Athens. I mean, there's all sorts of stories. But he becomes this character. He becomes this character, Tahir Bey. Talk to me about how that character develops insofar as we can work it out.
Yeah, so we can't really be sure. I mean, maybe we can't be sure of anything, but we can't be extremely confident of anything before he reaches Athens in 1923. So he reaches Athens in 1923 at the same time as a lot of refugees are coming into the city. He comes into a city that is in a refugee crisis. But we do have lots of snippets of his life before then and can piece together sort of something. So we're pretty confident in saying that he grew up in Istanbul, in an Armenian community. It's quite likely that in Istanbul he would have read, in a lot of accounts he's said to be a book dealer when he's younger, so that he might have read books on hypnotism, on this thing called Fakirism, which he really develops into a whole act, and the occult more generally, because in Istanbul in the late 19th and early 20th century, there are people who are starting to write about these kind of things. Then he sort of takes what I define as kind of the Armenian refugee route, right? He goes through Smyrna, now Izmir. He goes through Cairo and Alexandria. He goes through Salonika, now Thessaloniki. Whether or not he's actually in all of these places exactly, but there are stories about him in all of these places. And somewhere along the way, we don't know exactly how it happened, he adopts this personality, Tahra Bey. So when he arrives in Athens in 1923, he is put up by a man who runs an occult magazine and is called Tahra Bey the Fakir. And basically what he can do is withstand a huge amount of pain, shut off his body with the power of his mind, and then his big trick, the one that occurs throughout his career, is that he can put himself into a sort of death-like state and then have himself buried alive and stay underground for, he says, various different times. So he could say up to 24 hours, up to a few days. In reality, it usually turns out being about half an hour to an hour, and everyone's sort of accepts that that's enough. And so that's his kind of his act. But the powerful thing that he does, and this develops, I feel, as he travels through Europe, so there's less of it in Athens than there is in Paris, is that he also develops this philosophy to go alongside it. This philosophy that he calls Fakirism, which, in summary, is essentially that the human spirit has these powers that we don't understand, and he goes into this big backdrop of exactly how he discovered these things. You know, he learned them from a sheikh in Egypt somewhere, or he was raised a fakir by his father, or exactly what the backstory is sometimes changes. But the important thing is, right, he is an anti-materialistic kind of prophet. And that's how people take him. He dresses in these sort of exaggerated, quote-unquote, Arab-style robes, right? White with a big occult on the top.
No, I wanted to ask you about that, actually, because like he's really building this character. And to some extent, that's true of pretty much all of the figures that you mentioned in the book. And you focus mostly on Tahra Bey and Dr. Daesh, but there's this amazing supporting cast of characters. And yeah, perhaps the most, I want to say, ridiculous example of this is Rahman Bey, who's another fakir at the period, perhaps inspired by Tahra Bey, whose origin story maybe places him in Egypt or maybe India or Eritrea, but there's this amazing scene where a Syrian journalist kind of addresses him in Arabic and he doesn't understand a word of it because it turns out he's a young Italian from Florence called Antonesco Gemmi. And so what is it, do you think, that all of the practitioners of this movement need to develop some kind of character?
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of explanations to why that is. And yeah, Rahman Bey, along with another guy called Hamid Bey, and many others who I don't go into, all appear to me to be copycats of Tahra Bey. He is the guy who sort of started this, but then he gets all of these, copycats is probably the right word, rather than followers, although they sort of follow in his, but they don't support him, they're rivals, in a sense. And they're everywhere, not only those two, but there's two, Hamid Bey and Rahman Bey, who we look at. Really, that shows his popularity, basically, at least in my interpretation. That shows that the thing that he is selling, which is this kind of mystical message, this anti-materialist message, has this extreme popularity and this big purchase amongst crowds, which is why so many people rise up and do it. And so part of what I'm looking at in the book is saying, why were people, particularly in Europe and America, so keen to embrace this. And there's two reasons for this. And the second one is going to bring me back to why they had to have this persona. But the first one is kind of a little bit what we've talked about, right? This was a world that was in the wake of the First World War, perhaps also in the wake of the Spanish flu, but it was a world that felt broken. A civilization that felt that it was in some sense on its knees and it needed some kind of rebirth and change. And people were reaching everywhere. And I think, just in my sort of general reading of the 1920s, that's a very common feeling throughout Europe and also perhaps the Middle East, but in slightly different ways. So he clearly tapped into that feeling and was promising this new civilization. He was a missionary, but not, and as someone said about him, right, the West sent missionaries out to the East, or they used to. Now the East was sending missionaries back to heal the Western world.
Let's pick up on that relationship between the East and the West, because it's such a core part of the book and of this story. If you look at so many of the places where these characters develop, so you've got Istanbul, where Tahir Bey is originally from, you've got Beirut, where Dr. Dahesh makes his name, you look at Athens, which we just mentioned, they're often really clumsily labelled, as where East meets West. But for the people of the early to mid 20th century, it's actually this movement we've been discussing, the occult, that maybe best captures this idea, this kind of bridge of the East and the West. And you write in the book, the appearance of modern spiritual sciences upset the rigid dividing line that had been constructed between East and West in the 1920s and 30s. If the West was scientific and the East was spiritual, then who had more rights to the scientific study of the spirit? So what are these two things representing, these two poles representing, whether you think it's justified or not?
I think one thing that this book actually tries to do a lot in setting up this East and West is to say that, this idea of East and West just kind of doesn't make sense. I think that's not a particularly radical thing to say. I think most people would probably agree with that. But even in the 1920s, its contradictions really are apparent. So Tahir Bey, why did he need to adopt this very Eastern character? One interpretation of Tahir Bey's sort of extravagant Eastern persona is that, he's just cheating these ignorant Westerners who don't really understand what they are dealing with. They have this exotic view of the East and he's exploiting it. Part of that is true. But then the more you go into these stories and the more you go actually into the way that these movements and ideas and performances too actually bounce around the world, the more you see that this vision of East and West, one being mystical, spiritual and exotic and all the rest of it, and the other being rational and scientific and so forth, those old stereotypes, doesn't work even when people are really trying to cling on to it. It's because Tahir Bey becomes this big European star, this big global star.
And he's really playing into this, right? Because he heads towards Paris in the 1920s, which is super fertile ground for him. Perhaps we can discuss that. But you write, as Tahir Bey travelled further west, his persona slowly became more Eastern. And so he knows that there's something there that he can make something out of, whether or not it's kind of legitimate. What do you think he's doing there?
In one sense he is just exploiting a certain ignorance about what the East is, and he can come up with this mad backstory, which is clearly not true, about growing up as a fakir in Egypt and having to leave because of he says the Arab revolt in 1908. This is part of his biography, which is a thing that never existed. So in one sense that there is that, but it's also it's representative of some kind of desire in the West, not just for the exotic East, but for a change, for some kind of miracle, for anything. And people will kind of grab onto anything. But then what makes it more complicated is after Paris, where he becomes this big star.
Yeah. The New Yorker says that the city quivers in excitement with his shows, and there's this amazing detail that you have people like Marie Curie, this kind of complete figurehead of the age of reason, I guess, attending one of his shows.
Yeah, and that does happen. There's a couple of years when he is the talk of the town, and all the occult scientists are onto it. And he gives this big demonstration in the Theosophical Hall, and it's full of kind of both respectable science and the fringes of science, because that's also one thing that he represents, the potential for science to move into these directions that we don't usually think of as scientific, right? The science of the spirit, right? And so at his demonstration, there's also this guy who is experimenting with making you younger by transfusing blood into you and all of these sort of like mad scientific things. But then what's interesting about Tahirbe's story, or at least one of the many interesting things about Tahirbe's life story, which, as maybe we'll see, bounces around the world a huge amount, is in the late 1920s, he kind of goes back to the Middle East. He is re-exported to the Middle East with the same kind of show. So in 1927, I think it is, he goes to Cairo and Alexandria, and there's this big, he appears on the front page of Egyptian magazines as Ajubat al-Asr, the miracle of the age. And he also goes to Beirut and performs there too. He has to change slightly his message because this idea of being this Eastern prophet come to save the souls of the West doesn't quite fit. But he is still selling a lot of the same kind of things. Is still kind of proposing a lot of the same things, which is the unknowability of the world beyond the perceptible and the ability of certain kinds of potentially slightly unusual sciences of the spirit, whatever you want to call it, to access that world. And that's a thing I think that motivates pretty much everyone in this book, and a thing that's very hard to disprove, right? I mean, the reason why it's so appealing is that we all kind of sense in a way that it's true, that there are things we don't understand, and they're offering
things
answers.
Yeah,
they're very much offering answers, and in this world of the 1920s particularly, which is in such desperate need of answers.
We're leaving Tahirbe in Beirut, which is the location for where Dr. Dahesh is also going to make his name. Let's get on to Dr. Dahesh. So he's initially born Salim Musa Ashi in Jerusalem sometime around 1910. And like Tahirbe, he's not born into a wealthy family. His father dies when he's just around 10, and he's earning a few bucks for the family here and there, performing almost magic tricks around and about. And he starts eventually touring Palestine and the neighboring area. And his show does have very similar elements to that of Tahirbe. And so tell me about what they share in common and how Dr. Dahesh eventually, when he becomes Dr. Dahesh, kind of makes his show his own, or makes his act his own.
Yeah, or it's how he tailors his message, I feel. To the people. And so Dr. Dahesh too, he has two potential birth dates, which are given 1909 and 1912. It's quite hard to separate between them. And again, like Tahirbe, his early life is pretty hard to pin down because it's all told much later after he's become this occult superstar. But born into probably more poverty than Tahirbe. He seems to have born into quite severe poverty. He was the only education, it's always said, that he got was in an orphanage for sort of 1 year. That was in Lebanon, just outside Beirut. Then the family moves. Importantly, I think too, it's an Assyrian family, a sort of Syriac-speaking family, and like Tahirbe, he is a minority in the Middle East, and a minority that had experienced genocide, basically, both Assyrian and Armenian.
And he's also eventually displaced from the place that he initially grew up in as well. He shares that in common with Tahirbe.
Yeah, and I think there's definitely something to that, right? That both of these two men represent something of the displacement and the crisis of this late Ottoman world, and manifest it as something miraculous and mysterious and mystical, and take all of that kind of suffering and give it form. I think there's definitely something going on with all of that. But to get back to the details of Dr. Dahesh himself, through his teenage years, basically pretty opaque, Probably he was performing some kind of magic tricks. There's someone who claims to have got a program of him performing these magic tricks in Amman in 1927. But he hits the kind of the historical record in Jerusalem in 1929 doing a fakir show, essentially doing Tahra Bey's act. He shows the audience how he can withstand pain. He does a burial alive like Tahra Bey does. He is showing them the power, these mysterious powers of the spirit, the same kind of thing. He is, in a sense, in 1929, a follower of Tahra Bey, like a Rahman Bey, like a Hamid Bey. He calls himself Dr. Derhish Bey, in fact. But, yeah, like you say, throughout the 1930s, his kind of persona changes. And if you want to put it like this, he kind of becomes a mirror image of Tahra Bey. So Tahra Bey, who is this exaggerated Easterner who is selling the secrets of the occult in the West, he becomes more kind of westernized, as it were. So Tahra Bey wears these big robes. Dr. Derhish wears a nice suit with a bow tie and a sort of pocket square and all of this kind of stuff, and says that he has qualifications from France. He claims to have a diploma in some psychic sciences from France. And importantly, he really leans into, in the 1930s, both hypnotism and spiritualism, very specifically defined. And spiritualism is another one of these things that is sort of talked about like the occult as just some kind of mystical thing. But in this period, it was a big movement, and it was a specific movement which was based on two propositions. The first, a reasonably well-accepted proposition across most religions, that the soul survives after death. The second, more controversial, that people in this world could contact the souls of the people who had survived after death and talk to them. And so Dr. Derhish started doing that and also hypnotism in Palestine and using it kind of often to answer people's questions, like, where's my lost ring? Or who stole the papers off my desk, or this kind of thing.
And so this isn't Paris of the 1920s, but it's still an environment that is ripe for ideas that wants some new ideas. It's kind of going through this post-Ottoman revival. It's the period of the Nahda, this kind of intellectual renaissance period. And so what is it about the elements of the time that make what Dr. Derhish is offering in the Middle East, which makes that so attractive for the people there?
I think the basic answer to that, and actually the basic answer to all of these guys, Tahra Bey, Dr. Derhish, also the Rahman Bey and Hamid Bey who go to America, is they're answering the questions of modernity, basically. They are these kind of archetypes of sort of mystical figures who could only exist in this period when modernity has been sort of thrust into the world in these quite violent ways. Now, that plays out in extremely different ways in Europe and also in America. So, I mean, in America, they tend to focus much more on this kind of a more anti-materialistic, kind of anti-consumerist, but also at the same time selling you things kind of message. Whereas modernity has also kind of come to the Middle East in extremely violent and powerful ways, often in consort with colonialism, and has shaken the world up there too. So all of these people are kind of responses to that, the shaking of the world, this kind of upturning of the world that has come in the 1920s. Okay, you can trace it back further a little bit if you want to, but let's say it reaches ahead in the 1920s and into the 30s, and they're giving their responses to it. And Derhish's response to it is to harness this power of Western science. So he plays up, so he's not the only hypnotist, spiritualist going around the Middle East at this point, right? And one of the things I wanted to do is put everyone in their kind of context.
Yeah, for sure.
And he is, in fact, probably in the 1930s, not even the most famous one. The most famous one is this guy called Dr. Salomon Bey, who, again, does this hypnotist, spiritualist kind of performance, dressed up in a suit in much the same way that Dr. Derhish Bey is. But he claims to have a degree from the University of Brussels and to be using the latest Western science, and that's kind of how they justify and sort of explain their skills, even though they're doing really very similar things.
Yeah, that's one of the ironies I found throughout reading the book is that, as you say, that people consulted hypnotists. In the book, you write, people consulted hypnotists like Dr. Dahish for the same reasons they used jinn summoners, to see into their future and all this kind of thing. And a lot of the miracles or the tricks, however you want to put it, that Dr. Dahish performs, we've seen them before. We've seen them in Tahrir Bay. At one point, his followers are astonished because he turns water into wine. I mean, these aren't entirely new ideas. So it's an amazing ability to turn old ideas into a completely new message, I guess. Is that it?
Yeah, and one that is tailored particularly for the time, I suppose. But yeah, I think always people want to know the answers to things that they can't quite find out. And the uncertainty and the anxiety. This is true of sort of everything. And in an age of anxiety, that's gonna happen much more. Then, so that's where we're at in the 20s and 30s, broadly speaking.
Yeah. So let's go with Dahish. He's accused of fraud in Palestine in 1937. He's also facing accusations of preying on vulnerable women. And so he flees Palestine to Beirut. And this is where his message, his act becomes a real movement. And as you write in the book, its disciples believe that here in Beirut, this movement could bring an end to bigotry, chauvinism, and sectarianism if they could unite every faith under one banner. And so his radical anti-sectarian message helped Dr. Dahish to flourish in the early 1940s Beirut in a way that he never managed in Palestine. How does this message become a movement?
Yeah, so he leaves Palestine. He has actually kind of tried to start a movement in Palestine already, but it all falls apart with these accusations of fraud and everything. He ends up in Beirut, and there he stops performing really in the same way, at least on stages. And people stop talking much about his history in Palestine. The kind of a line is drawn under that. And he starts this, what do we call it? It's perhaps a religion, although there's some debate over whether it is a religion. Perhaps it's a message, perhaps it's sort of a philosophical creed of some kind, but which is called Dahishism, after him. And the precise kind of contours of this creed are a little bit hard to come across. But first, the more popular thing about this movement is that it's a message to unite all religions. Again, not a hugely original thing to do, but one that gets a lot of take-up in Beirut of the 1940s. So, it'll help Christians become better Christians, but they will also learn about Islam, and they'll appreciate Islam, and Muslims will learn about Christianity, and it'll all sort of come together in this great sort of utopian vision, which attracts a good number of people. It's always a little bit unclear exactly how many people it does really attract. Whether it's just the kind of 10 that we always hear about, or whether it's a sort of backdrop of many more. But the important thing is that it attracts some pretty important people.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so he ends up drawing the ire of the kind of the most important people in the country, essentially.
Yes, because it manages to attract the sister-in-law of Bashar al-Khoury, who was the president of Lebanon, a very big deal of a guy. Mary Haddad, born Shiha, is also from a very big family, and a sort of important family, who are probably, so it is always alleged, and it seems sort of logical, or working behind the scenes to try and take Dr. Dahish down. Because they're pretty worried about this new movement, which they see as being deeply suspicious. But at the same time, yes, he is doing something very different to what he was doing in Palestine and what Tahrir Bay is doing in Paris. But at the heart of it, at least so my sort of argument goes, he's replaying the same role, which is this kind of embodiment of some deep desire in society, some kind of like mystical embodiment in a sense, because Lebanon at this time is asking itself all these questions about how do we, it's newly independent, basically. This is all happening at the time it's gaining independence as a state. And the one thing everyone knows about Lebanon, right, is an extremely religiously diverse society, and one that it's quite difficult to maintain all of those different religions. And how are you supposed to go about doing this? And in fact, Marie Haddad's brother is one of the men who is charged with formulating the idea of how we go forward, the National Pact, right, it's always called, and this very fine balance between all of the sects and everything. And that's one solution, but Daesh is offering this totally radical solution to it. This solution of complete religious equality, sort of almost the ending of religion, or not the ending of religion, the ending of any sectarian differences, which then kind of explains why he might be appealing to people in this country.
Yeah, but also it's not going to be that popular with the religious establishment at the same time, or the political establishment.
No, and he has, in his writings, he clearly has a hatred of the religious establishment, particularly sort of the Christian clergy, it seems. And whether, which came first, the chicken or the egg at this stage, or whether this sort of movement is partly influenced by this suspicion of the clergy and the religious establishment, or whether the fact that the religious establishment came up against him made him hate them. It's a little bit hard to say. But yeah, it doesn't take long before this long list of enemies makes things end up pretty badly for Daesh, and he is expelled from Lebanon.
And so, without giving away too many spoilers, neither of these two men managed to sustain their huge popularity. And you go into fantastic detail in the book about how they end up falling from grace. Both of their stories are fascinating. But essentially, I mean, Tahir Bey ends up kind of a convicted fraudster, and Dr. Daesh fakes his own death, apparently, only to end his days apparently coming back to life and living the life of a wealthy retiree. But he's more like, as he writes, he's more like an eccentric uncle than the man who had once terrified Lebanon's political elite. And so I'm wondering why you think that their popularity did collapse, and was their popularity initially due to them being the right men at the right time, and when that time passed they were just no longer needed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is my answer, and I think kind of that's what in a sense, what the book is saying, that these guys are very interesting on themselves, and their lives are very interesting. But the main reason, the answer to the question that we semi-started with which was, is there anything to it, is not about them, it's about what they represent. What is important about them is that they embody something of the anxiety of the age, of the troubles of the age. And this book, I guess, is a project. The thing you need to ask yourself when writing history, probably, buy this or don't buy it, is that everything always depends on the view that you see it from. Whose perspective, kind of, are you seeing this from? And what I found eventually the most interesting thing about this occult movement is that it gives you this new and interesting perspective to look at these same old questions of what's going on in the 1920s and 1930s. Like, how do we look at Palestine, for instance, in 1930? A lot has been written about Palestine in 1930. It's an extremely important time in the history. But what does it look like from the perspective of these sort of marginal, sort of unusual, mystical figures?
Yeah.
What are they showing us that other people can't?
All right. Raphael Cormack, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
This has been The Lead from New Lines magazine. Raphael Cormack's book, Holy Men of the Electromagnetic Age, A Forgotten History of the Occult, is available for pre-order now on Hearst in the UK and W.W. Norton in the US, and it will be on general release in March. This episode was produced and hosted by me, Finbar Anderson. For more like this, subscribe to The Lead on your favourite podcast app or visit our website, newlinesmag.com.